Most people are very gentle in their nature. They live in an illusory world. They have no idea what is happening around them, behind the walls or beyond their borders. It's very difficult for people living in a society spoiled by the digital civilization to imagine just how cruel other people can actually be to one another. It is highly unlikely that European diplomats, while passively watching the war that began in the east of Ukraine, could predict that the Russian bear would deliver a senseless and merciless blow as quickly as it did. On July 17, 2014, at 15:53 Kyiv time, the Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777 aircraft entered the zone of responsibility of the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast Flight Information Service. A Ukrainian dispatcher undertook the task of escorting the plane. By 16:21 Kyiv time, the plane disappeared from the radar screen. The wreckage of the airliner fell to the ground near the village of Hrabovo in the Donetsk Oblast of Ukraine. There were 283 passengers and 15 crew members on board. Unfortunately, none of them survived. Flight Amsterdam-Kuala Lumpur, code number MH-17. This is the 13th episode of the film about the ATO, the history of war. We're trying to understand the course of the anti-terrorist operation in the east of Ukraine, its causes and effects. What does the Russian Federation have to do with all this? And how does the confrontation between Ukraine and Russia pose a potential threat to Europe? There's a term among historians, black swan. It is an accident, the rarest coincidence that affects the course of world history in a critical manner. The tragedy of the Malaysian Airlines Boeing reminded the world that anyone can become a victim of war or international terrorism regardless of their citizenship and worldview. So what happened to the Boeing? Was it malice, a technical error, or a special service operation? Stay with us. This program will be interesting. In early summer of 2014, the Ukrainian army and the National Guard launched an offensive against the positions of pro-Russian militants, liberating previously occupied settlements. Using all available military forces and manpower, the Ukrainian command actively applied its air force. Aircraft and helicopters were especially activated for the rapid transfer of troops and supplies as well as for airstrikes. The militants tried in every way possible to resolve the air defense issue. Portable anti-aircraft missiles appeared in the arsenal of weaponry of the pro-Russian terrorists in the Donbass back in June, including the latest Russian development Vrba. On June 6th, an aircraft photo surveyor An-30 was shot down above Slavyansk. By July, the flight of the Slavyansk garrison was covered by the Strela 10 mobile systems received from Russia. On July 16th, the Ukrainian fighter jet Su-25M1 was shot down in the Ambrosivka region. It is noteworthy that this aircraft was destroyed not from the ground, but with an air-to-air missile launched from a Russian fighter jet. The air defense of the Russian Federation sought to provide the militants with air cover in every way possible. In early summer, all the airspace above the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts was closed for civilian aircraft. The State Aviation Service of Ukraine made an exception only for the transit aircraft that flew above the territory of Ukraine at altitudes of over 9,800 meters. That is, at an altitude which even the latest portable air defense missile systems and mobile installations that could have been at the disposal of the militants would not be capable of reaching. The altitude was considered safe in compliance with all international standards. Anchorman of a Russia TV channel. The militiamen reported that they managed to shoot down another transport aircraft of the Ukrainian Air Force. This happened above the city of Torres in the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic. On July 17th, the Russian-backed forces announced on social media that they shot down an An-26 transport aircraft of the Ukrainian Air Force near the city of Torres. In fact, a passenger liner was hit. The wreckage of the aircraft and the remains of its passengers were still falling to the ground from an altitude of 10 kilometers, and the Russian media had already announced that to the whole world, glorifying the new victory of the so-called Donetsk militia. There were certain reasons for the confidence of Russian-supported troops and Russian television channels in the destruction of the Ukrainian An-26 transport aircraft. The terrorists had informers in Dnipropetrovsk. They constantly reported the flights of Ukrainian aircraft. Indeed, on July 17th, a transport aircraft was due to fly out to deliver supplies to Ukrainian troops at the border. For technical reasons, the aircraft did not take off. The video from the scene of the event appeared on the internet very quickly, and the news of the downed plane was widely spread on the leading Russian TV channels. However, by the evening of the same day, after the situation was cleared up, all that information was removed from the TV broadcast. As if the previous statements were never made, Russian propaganda began to refute the involvement of pro-Russian militants in the incident. Journalists at first, and then the terrorist leaders, began to insist that the so-called militia lacked weapons powerful enough to bring down the aircraft at such an altitude. Indeed, from a purely technical standpoint, this was not lie. In fact, that very Buk anti-aircraft missile system used to shoot down the Malaysian airliner was transported away to the territory of Russia within a few hours after the terrorist attack was executed. An international investigation of the case was launched literally on the following day. On July 18th, 30 representatives of the OSCE arrived to Donetsk to gather information, search for the airplane's black box, and conduct an examination of the crash site. However, the armed representatives of the DPR kept on interfering with the international experts for several days, not giving them full access to the wreckage. The crash site of a plane is like a crime scene. Locations of bodies, personal belongings of passengers, flight recorders, and literally all the wreckage of the aircraft, everything is hard evidence. By not allowing the OSCE representatives to the wreckage, the militants quickly found the black boxes of the aircraft with the intent to transfer them to Russia, allegedly for examination. However, the very next day, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov announced that the equipment would promptly be transferred to the owner of the aircraft. It should be understood that flight recorders record the flight parameters and conversations in the cockpit, but the plane was in perfect working order. The civilian airliner had no missile attack warning devices on board. The Russian side transferred the two devices to the airline representatives without fear, as it was later found out by an independent international investigation. The attack was unexpected and the crew simply could not take any measures to evade the missile. Realizing that they committed a war crime, the terrorists urgently evacuated the murder weapon. But it's very difficult to hide anything in the modern digital world. The densely populated east of Ukraine hampers not just normal warfare, but also the secret transportation of weapons. Photos of the missile launched at the Malaysian aircraft appeared on the internet almost immediately. The same strange-looking combat vehicle that was being transported in a trailer kept appearing on mobile phone and DVR recordings. It was the aforementioned complex. A few years later, an international investigation restored the events of this day accurately and to the last minute, reliably establishing both the launch site of the missile and the belonging of the complex to the 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation. And now we return to Ukraine, to the hot summer of 2014. The Ukrainian armed forces did not have air defense facilities in the Donbass capable of shooting down planes at such altitudes. The only unit that possessed the Ukrainian Buk missile system was the 156th Donetsk Air Defense Missile Regiment. All the complexes of this unit were redeployed to the administrative border with Crimea in March. and the remaining garrison on the territory of the unit successfully resisted attempts of siege. Trying to hide the participation of Russia and hang the responsibility for the tragedy on the armed forces of Ukraine, the Russian media started coming up with various alternative versions of events. The first of them was aired on the Russia Today channel late in the evening on July 17th. A tweet by supposedly a Spanish dispatcher was posted, who claimed that a few minutes before the crash landing of the Boeing, Ukrainian military aircraft were spotted near it, which were allegedly using the civilian aircraft as a cover. In turn, the agency Interfax Russia came up with its own version. In their opinion, the Russian Air Force One, the plane of Russian President Putin, who was returning from a Latin American tour, was the target. The outlines of the aircraft are generally similar. The linear dimensions are also very similar, and as for the coloring, it is most identical at a fairly long distance. However, these hastily concocted stories were more focused on common viewers in Russia and were far from reality. The Buk anti-aircraft missile system could not physically observe the coloring of its target, since it fired from a distance of over 20 kilometers. The situation in the airspace is carefully documented at the international level as well, so it is not difficult to check what aircraft were flying over a certain region at that time. In the meantime, the search for dead bodies continued and there was looting at the crash site. Some elements of the fuselage had disappeared. Part of the personal belongings of passengers, their money, mobile phones, and even cosmetics were ended up in the pockets of the militants. Moreover, some of them later bragged about their rich trophies of war on social media. In the evening of July 21st, the train with the remains of the passengers and crew went to Kharkiv. The following day, the Interpol team began preliminary identification of the bodies. The Ukrainian authorities made an agreement with the Dutch on their transportation to the Netherlands for identification by relatives. The battles on the border in the east of Ukraine continued. The Russian artillery kept firing methodically at the positions of the Ukrainian military, and Russian television continued the vigorous bombardment of the minds of viewers with new versions of the events. Among the most famous attempts to shift the blame to Ukraine, there's the version about the Ukrainian fighter jet Su-25 and pilot Voloshin, who allegedly shot down the Boeing. Russian journalists did not answer the question why, for what purpose he did that, and on top of that, they did not even bother to study the technical characteristics of the aircraft. The fact is that the Su-25 fighter jet was designed to operate near the ground and attack ground targets at extremely low altitudes. Its cockpit is not sealed. Technically, the jet can climb to 10,000 meters, the same altitude at which the Malaysian Boeing was flying. But because of rarefied air, the pilot would lose consciousness and die. A bit later, attempts were made to falsify satellite imagery in which Ukrainian missile complexes were allegedly disappearing and reappearing. There was even a version about the Ukrainian fighter jet Su-27, which ostensibly fired a missile at the Malaysian airliner. Channel 1 Russia continued exaggerating that version by creating 3D models and demonstrations, but it could not stand up to any of the blatant and harsh criticism. The quality of the forgery was very clumsy. The planes were disproportionately large. The photos showed a Boeing 737 instead of the downed Boeing 777, and their silhouettes are different. An actual missile launch is executed from an entirely different angle, and, as the investigation later established, the plane was hit in the frontal hemisphere. One important point should be made clear here. All these fake versions are not a mistake of journalists eager to sensationalize, rather a deliberate operation mind crime. It is propaganda oriented towards domestic consumption. It is a picture for the inhabitants of Russian villages living in fringes of the country. Its purpose was to present Ukraine as a universal evil and secretly mobilize the Russian audience against Ukraine and its citizens. The fact that the Malaysian Boeing was shot down using the Buk anti-aircraft missile complex was finally confirmed in 2015. The wreckage of the plane was collected and transported to the Netherlands. Investigating the plane crash by standard protocols, experts collected what was left of the aircraft on a special stand. That allowed them to establish the nature of the damage and recreate the approximate course of events. Anti-aircraft missiles are designed in such a way as to cause critical damage to the aircraft without a direct hit. The missile approaches the target and explodes at a calculated distance from it, thus hitting the aircraft with numerous fragments. In layman's terms, the explosion of such a missile sends calibrated fragments manufactured at a factory that fly out in a cloud of a certain shape. Based on the fragment scatter diagram, the missile is pre-programmed with the trajectory towards an aircraft and the distance to the target at which it explodes, thus causing maximum damage. In this case, the explosion happened near the bow. The rocket approached from the front bottom right and literally cut the cockpit in half with the fragments. Further destruction of the structure of the plane occurred from explosive decompression. In short, the plane burst like a balloon. The crew and passengers were either already dead or unconscious long before the plane fell to the ground. The international investigation established the nationality of the complex. Forensic experts extracted fragments of the missile warhead from the bodies of pilots and passengers. Ironically, back in 1997, 3 battalions of Buk missile systems were transferred to Finland as a payment for the state debt of the USSR. Those were armed with 9 M38 missiles, the same as in Ukraine. The payload of the old model of the Buk missile consisted of small steel cubes. At the same time, the experts extracted not only the cubes but also butterfly-like heavy damaging elements from the bodies of the passengers and flight crew. And that's the payload of the 9N314M missile, ammunition that is in service only in the Russian army. The investigation has been going on for several years. How the missile system was brought to Ukraine has been determined. The chronology of those days has been restored, and the location of the missile launch and the names of people involved in the tragedy have also been found. Even Russian propaganda, unable to withstand obvious facts, smoothly shifted the focus of its information war on the domestic public. But the question remains, what for? For what purpose were such serious and deadly weapons transferred to the militants? After all, it would have been wiser to fight Ukrainian aviation with portable air defense systems and short-range systems, which Russia has plenty of. Moreover, it would have been easier to disguise those weapons by the standard scheme as trophies of war. Simply put, the Buk SAM was created during the Cold War and was intended to combat NATO's strategic bombers or cruise missiles, but not at all for attempts to shoot down a sluggish An-26 transport aircraft or a single helicopter from the skies. Unfortunately, everything is very simple. The terrorists confused their targets. At the same time, with the Malaysian Boeing, the route of Aeroflot flight Moscow-Larnaca flew through the skies over the east of Ukraine. At 16:09, the routes of the two planes intersected. The Malaysian Boeing was at an altitude of 10,100 meters and the Russian plane was 500 meters higher. Had the Russian plane been shot down, then according to international law, Russian experts would have investigated the plane crash. They would have carried out the investigation as the Russian authorities wanted, and similarly to their Western colleagues, would have been engaged in it for a very long time. The distraction of the aircraft would have become an excellent reason for the introduction of troops, yet another peacekeeping mission and a formal precept for war. Casus belli. However, not being familiar with the terrain, the militants, having received an order to take position near the village of Pervomaisk, did not take into account the fact that there are several settlements with the same name in the vicinity of Donetsk. It was a special operation, a provocation, a tragic mistake and a war crime. and the passengers of the Malaysian Boeing did more than just save those in the Russian plane at the cost of their lives. The delay in the introduction of regular troops of the Russian Federation into the territory of Ukraine allowed the Ukrainian army to strengthen itself and cover the civilized world from the cruel Russian world. That was the black swan of the Donbass.